Find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Watch our YouTube channel, Hidden Truth Show. Please subscribe, rate, and review us on your podcast app. Here's Jim Breslow.
Welcome back to the Hidden Truth Show. Today we continue our Legalize It deep dive about the legalization of recreational drugs in the U.S. John Norris is the author of Hidden War, How Special Operations Game Wardens Are Reclaiming America's Wildlands from the Drug Cartels. Norris was a California game warden for many years. His job was to protect hunting, fishing, and hiking on state lands. That all changed when one day he stumbled upon a big marijuana farm on state land. Incredibly, it was being guarded by Mexican drug cartels. His job ultimately morphed into fighting these cartels over their multi-million-dollar illegal drug farms in California. In the interview, he reports that there are approximately 10,000 Mexican drug cartel members living in California. They oversee huge marijuana fields on state and federal lands. He reports that they grow as much marijuana in California as do all of the legal growers combined. They cross illegally into California in order to illegally grow and sell drugs. Yet California's sanctuary state laws protect them from deportation. Unbelievable. Before we start the interview, a reminder to please join our search for the truth by becoming a Hidden Truth Show subscriber. For just $5 a month, you'll receive newsletters, special episodes, a Hidden Truth baseball cap, and email access to me to share your thoughts and questions. Go to patreon.com/Hidden Truth Show. That's patreon.com/Hidden Truth Show. Okay, now for our interview with John Norris, author of Hidden War. I started by asking him exactly how long the cartels have been growing marijuana in California.
Yeah, we know approximately it started back in the mid-'80s. That's when the first cartel groups from Mexico basically breached the border out of San Diego and started putting these, illegal trespass marijuana grows and these encampments in the National Forest especially, right down into like San Diego, Riverside County, where I started my career back in 1992 as a fish and game warden. I was right in the Temecula, Riverside County area. And I actually gone into a handful of grow sites with Forest Service officers, law enforcement officers, way back then. And they were embedded pretty heavy and mostly in Southern California. And then since then, they've migrated north to the entire rest of California, the whole West Coast, all the way up to the Canadian border, and in about 25 other states nationally.
So I assume their analysis was very simple. They're going through all this hassle to figure out how to bring marijuana across the border into the United States, which they were quite successful at, but it's also very dangerous and expensive. And they're like, wait a minute, why don't we just grow it in California? Then we don't have to worry about getting it across the border.
Exactly. They eliminated a step. They eliminated basically a roadblock along the way. Now, they still do produce in Mexico, in central Mexico. And we got to remember, Jim, that this is the tainted cannabis. It has the EPA banned poisons on it directly, not only on the waterways and the soil around where it's grown, but actually on the plant and the bud material people ingest itself. So the method they've used in Mexico for many, many decades, they just brought up to America through California first to do as well. So grown within our country to take out that hindrance of, like you said, getting across the border. And then in addition to that, still grown in Mexico and still smuggled across the border. It's also brought in on the water, which I talk about a little bit in the new book, Hidden War, and we got into it a little bit on some other shows, is the panga boats, the one-way, clandestine cartel panga boats that are made to bring a big load of 3,000 to 6,000 pounds of this toxically tainted weed onto the coastline, or methamphetamine or fentanyl, or even traffic people. And then it's a disposable boat. And that load gets into the American black market to be distributed all over the country on the West Coast, usually of California and north of there.
So let's talk some numbers, and let's start with percentages. So what percentage of cartel marijuana would you say comes across the border as opposed to being grown in the U.S.?
As far as how much makes it to America in the total market?
No, what I'm saying is, well, maybe that's the question, but really when we look about cartel marijuana sales in the U.S., that marijuana, what percentage of that marijuana was grown in the U.S. versus somehow came in into the U.S. from Mexico?
Yeah, the stuff grown in America that's on the clandestine black market for the whole country, somewhere between 60 and 80%, a large number of it.
Okay, so basically that's their primary way of selling marijuana into the U.S. is just growing it in the U.S.
Most of it is, but I've been doing a lot of work on the border, filming shows down there, talking with Border Patrol agents, and dealing with the trafficking and the cartel routes in Southwest Texas on the Arizona border. And I've just learned recently that the numbers we thought were kind of low as far as stuff coming across the border are a lot higher than we thought. I mean, to the tune of where it's coming close to matching what's generated, say, in California, which is the biggest weed producing state for the cartels, and of course for legitimate growers because we're a Mediterranean climate and we are a great marijuana state for growing outdoors and indoors. But it's pretty eye-opening and shocking to me what I've learned actually in the last couple of months of how much the numbers on the border are increasing from stuff coming in from south of the border.
Well, and again, when we say stuff, as a result of them now being able to grow in the U.S., the marijuana, does that mean that they've shifted their attention a little bit more to other drugs, getting those across?
They certainly have. You see methamphetamine smuggled across the border, the synthetic heroin fentanyl that's highly, highly potent, very concentrated, that's killing thousands of people across the U.S. being used improperly. We're seeing a lot more of that coming across the border. And like the tainted weed that's produced in the U.S. by the cartels, they're producing those same other, what we call the white drugs, the other narcotics in America as well.
So if we had a pie chart for what's coming across, give me some percentages as to what percent, kind of from a dollar standpoint, I guess, is marijuana, consists of marijuana versus, let's say, cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and whatever I'm missing.
Well, yeah, you're going to see a much higher number value numerically from a financial standpoint to drugs like cocaine because the cost is so much higher because it's so much more concentrated. But you're looking at approximately, and these are very general approximations because it's ebbing and flowing on what we're seeing with trends increasing and decreasing, but probably a little less than half of what's getting into America, or right at the halfway point, is being produced in Mexico and smuggled across.
Half of what?
Everything. Tainted weed, methamphetamine, the fentanyl, as well as human trafficking, which everything is coming, primarily from the south to the north. When it comes to moving people across the border as well.
Yeah. So, and how many cartels are we dealing with right now? Do you know? In Mexican cartels?
There's so many because the major cartels like Sinaloa, the New Generation Cartel, what used to be called La Familia Michoacana or LFM cartel, there's a new version of that, but they've all broken into little cells that are, rivaling right now. I mean, the cartel war is going down in dangerous cities like Juarez, right on the Southwest Texas border. They've all broken into factions. They're all loosely associated with each other, but they're territorial. So that impact is now transcended into America, where we know Sinaloa is embedded in America. We know the New Generation Cartel is embedded in America. Our team sees signs of that all the time. But to pin it down to just those guys would be erroneous to do, because we know the trends happening south of the border they've bisected and splintered so much into rival factions. We have many rival factions throughout America embedded, doing drug crimes, trafficking in humans, running guns, you name it, a multitude of crimes.
What is their involvement with gangs in California? Do they have direct involvement with our gangs?
That's a great question. I don't get too much in, and basically they do. They sublet or basically subcontract in grow sites especially. We've seen MS-13 gang members. We've seen Asian gang members, violent crews from different factions that aren't from Mexico but have a gang embeddedness here in America. We'll use California as an example, my old home state where we built the marijuana enforcement team. We see a lot of these gang members working for the cartels directly and running operations on the ground. Quite a bit, actually.
Aren't the gangs the primary retailer of the drugs?
Yes, in many cases they are, because they're embedded here. A lot of them have citizenship, they have infrastructure, they have distribution. So it's a very cooperative network of utilizing assets they already have, like contractors that know what they're doing in America, to distribute that foreign entity, if you will, for their black market purposes.
Mm-hmm. What about the ones everybody always used to hear about? I don't keep up in the gang theory, but there's always the Crips and the Bloods in South Central LA. The Crips and the Bloods, first of all, were major drug dealers. Am I correct?
They were primarily in the cocaine and the crack cocaine trade,
and therefore you need to have therefore you need to have a relationship with the cartels if you're going to be getting this product from across the border, right?
You very much do. You very much do. And we got to remember, it's not just those embedded gang members that are distribution. It's a lot of growers. It's a lot of distributors. It's a lot of armed gunmen and defenders from Mexico that get their vettedness and their expertise and their effectiveness down in the central highlands of Mexico, growing tainted weed, producing methamphetamine. And then once they are vetted and good at what they're doing down there, and they do it successfully against the Mexican government and the police forces or military, then the cartels will spend the money to send them across the border, get them smuggled very easily without any hindrance or very little hindrance to embed in America and save that step we talked about as when we started discussing this today.
How many cartel members do you believe are in California right now as a part of this operation?
Oh, man, I'm a conservative estimate. I'm going to say 10,000, and it's probably much higher than that, because what is so crazy and what we really started to learn through intel circles and as we fought this fight directly as a focused effort with our new team that developed in 2013, we started to learn the infrastructure. We started to be able to debrief some of these upper level cartel plaza bosses that were responsible for 50 to say 100 grows in half of California or maybe even other states. And to hear them talk about moving personnel around like an apprentice commodity, if like, say you're a journeyman electrician, and you can work on Levi Stadium and build the new 49ers stadium as an electrician, but all of a sudden you're needed to go to Seattle to work on another high-tech project. You move to do that because you have expertise. They work the same way. Their business model is very organized, it's very logical, it's very efficient, and they need more vetted guys that are really good at what they're doing in grow sites, in distribution centers, defending this stuff, from the field to distribution centers to get to the black market. They need a lot of personnel, and it's much easier to have them embedded kind of covertly in America than have to deal with that border crossing all the time. So conservative estimate, 10,000 in California alone, and that's probably a very conservative estimate. But when you look at the rest of the country that's affected by this, the numbers are much higher. Because even though this is a California-based problem, and where my experience lies, we've learned that these cartels have human trafficking networks, methamphetamine production in all 50 states in the lower 48. We know they're embedded in every state. So that takes personnel. And we know what's happening in California on the weed front being, the primary method of profit and lucrative profit for the cartels in California, because we grow so much good weed here. The numbers are much higher nationwide than that.
So the operation started in California, but it has now moved nationwide.
It has. And as my book goes in on Hidden War, we have a grid map at the end of the book, Jim, that goes into presence we know in certain states. And we know that 25 to 27 other states besides California have this toxically tainted marijuana production being done in those states by the cartels. But we want to remember that these groups aren't just doing toxically tainted weed and all the environmental crime and public safety goes along with that. They're also doing, like we said, methamphetamine, fentanyl production, human trafficking, et cetera, in all 50 states. And these are all the same groups. So it's not like one group's just doing meth and then the marijuana experts are doing marijuana. They're all multi-trained and doing different things at different parts of the year. It's a business enterprise that the more product they can put out, the more profit they generate. So the diversity of them being skilled in everything is beneficial to the organization.
And what's the estimate for dollar amount of annual growth in California, whether you want to use the wholesale number or the retail number, either one, but what's the dollar amount?
In California, we're talking hundreds of millions, if not low billions. To put it in perspective, we estimate between 4,000 and 6,000 DTO, what we call drug trafficking organization, i.e. cartel marijuana grows in California alone every year.
What's the number again?
And 4,000 to 6,000.
4,000 to 6,000 operations, basically, farms.
Correct. Yep. Grow sites. And in those grow sites, you're talking about a small grow site is about 2,000 plants. And a monstrous one might be 50 to 100,000 plants. Let's take 5,000 plants as being average across the board. And if you take 5,000 plants and you know that every plant they grow is going to produce 1 pound to 2 pounds, maybe more, of marketable bud material from each plant. And even if you're talking $800, $900, $1,000 or less per plant, you add it to 5,000 and do the multiplication. You're talking about a whole lot of zeros. You're talking about low couple million on a small grow, and you're talking 20, 30, 40 million profit on a big grow over 20,000 plants. And knowing that we interdict, we estimate if we're lucky, we're getting 25 to maybe 35% of this. at the most. We're talking about a lot of stuff making it into the black market, and a lot of black market money in the high hundreds of millions, if not higher, making it into the cartel's infrastructure.
So in California, is there more legal, under California law, legal marijuana grown or illegal marijuana grown?
I would say more illegal marijuana grown, because we've regulated in California. We've made it legal on recreational front. We made it legal on the medicinal front, but we still have a lot of those growers not in compliance because of the fees to do so, the permits needed, the inspection they're going to have from agencies like California Department of Fish and Wildlife or Water Board or other police regulatory agencies on the cannabis front. So we've actually seen a backlash since we regulated in California the way we've regulated, to an increase in the black market, with not only the cartels, which were always going to be black market regardless of regulation in California or not, but now with the quasi-legitimate growers saying, okay, I can't afford to regulate. I can't afford to go through all this permit process and pay these fees, and I don't want to be on the radar. I'm just going to stay black market and take my chances. So we've unfortunately seen the black market increase on both fronts, not just on the cartel trespass stuff.
All of these illegal drugs, probably $1 billion plus that the cartels are growing in California, is all of this being sold on the black market, or is any of it, from a retail standpoint, is any of it making its way, maybe not necessarily to MedMen, but I'll ask the question about MedMen or the other legal dispensaries. Do you think any of it's being sold through these legal dispensaries?
We have seen in investigations, at least a small percentage has gotten into dispensaries, illegitimately. Whether it got in the back door, whether it was, sold as a wholesale product from a black market source. We have seen it in some dispensaries. Fortunately, most of the dispensaries we see in California, as an example, knowing California regulation and cannabis issues, being my home state, most of the dispensaries, a vast majority of them, are not having this stuff come through their dispensaries. They're getting organic testing. They're looking for pesticides on the plants. They're being rated and certified and tested now for purity, which is really essential for cannabis users in the legitimate market, that they're not ingesting these banned poisons on cartel marijuana when they're going to a dispensary thinking they're getting a pure product. So fortunately,
these
you don't
drugs
have a whole lot of it in dispensaries.
So they're still being sold the old-fashioned way, dealers on the street, essentially.
Essentially, they are.
And
so.
that business,
black market dealers.
And I like to say focus on California just because we're here and just because it's the biggest. That business, theoretically, the black market sale of marijuana, the illegal sale of marijuana, the street sale through the local dealer, that should be declining based on the legalization of marijuana and now being able to get it at MedMen or your local dispensary. So is that happening or not? Is illegal sales declining?
Illegal sales are not declining, and this is the problem. When you can get really, really potent high THC content, cartel black market marijuana for half or less than the price of organically pure, well-produced, inspected, basically seed to plant to sale cannabis, people are going to go for that black market price and that price savings. It's just the way the black market has always worked. So sadly, the way things are structured right now, it is not helping reduce the black market, and the black market is thriving because potent weed is very low cost on the black market. Even though if it's a cartel grow, it's probably got EPA banned carbofuran poisons all over it, and you're ingesting nerve agents and carcinogens without knowing it. But the demand is there in America for this stuff, so it's thriving.
Not to mention it's not taxed.
It's not taxed. It's completely underground. It's cash sales only. So there's a whole nother element of, economy and, checks and balances, if you will, in the business model throughout America being basically subverted.
Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of people, I know the word's getting out thanks to you and others, but I think there's still a huge percentage of the population that knows nothing about this, that the Mexican drug cartels are operating a billion-dollar business within the state of California, and you're saying it's been going on for decades.
Correct.
You personally discovered, you stumbled upon a site in 2004, right, and have been working on it ever since. I guess one question for you is, when you stumbled upon it and learned about this for the first time, and then you shared this information with others, were they saying, oh yeah, this is a big problem, this has been around for a long time?
Back then, where I found that grow site in the Silicon Valley, it was pretty common knowledge with narcotics law enforcement, traditional drug enforcement teams, to know that that was going on. But for game wardens to see it for the first time and to bring in conservationists and preservationists and outdoor enthusiasts to expose that element of what I was seeing, until my first book, War in the Woods, came out, and until we started doing the reality TV show about game wardens called Wild Justice on the National Geographic Channel, no one knew about this. The masses, the general public throughout America went, what the heck is going on? This is in America? Who are these guys?
Right. So before you guys joined the fight, who was fighting it? Was it just DEA? Was it state? Who was on the fight?
It was a multitude. It was drug task forces, what they call HIDTA teams, high intensity drug trafficking area teams, that were federally funded and state funded, which would have a plethora of officers from everything from highway patrol to police departments to federal law enforcement like Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service. We weren't involved in those quite yet.
Okay, so bottom line, the enforcement that was in place obviously was insufficient, because we went from having zero grown in California to it being $1 billion business. So this happened under the noses of state and federal authorities. It starts becoming more known thanks to you discovering it and writing a book about it and doing the Nat Geo thing, et cetera. So since it's now been better known, has additional resources been put on this compared to before, and how significant has the increase been?
Absolutely. A lot more resources have come to this, and not just because of our efforts on the Fish and Wildlife front and the game warden front, but everybody started to take notice. Federal funding started to shift from just eradicating plants to restoring environmental damage. The drug czars under the Obama administration and under the Trump administration are fully aware of what's going on with this, because of the press, because of the books, because of the TV shows, because of scientific work that groups like IERC, the NGO scientific study group that's looking at the poisons in the soils, the waterways from these trespass cartel grows, that's getting out into national news. All of those efforts are fueling awareness nationally. And I'm certainly now in retirement pushing awareness on the national front as far and wide as I can, like with you today. And I'm grateful for this, to expose the issue more and more, so we do get more funding.
So have these efforts resulted in less of it? Is it reducing it yet, or is it still growing?
Yeah, it's still growing, but we have gone from, I would say, when we first started doing this back in, say, 2004, when I found that first Silicon Valley grow site, all law enforcement entities at that time, we felt like we were lucky to get 5 to 10% of this stuff eradicated out of the field and stop these guys from operating in our forests within American soil. Now we're up to, maybe as much as 40% on a good day. So we're making a bigger dent. We're effectively taking more of it out. We're catching more people. We're putting more of a hindrance on their efforts, making it harder for them to profit, but we're not stopping it, because ultimately when 40 plus million Americans have a cannabis desire and they can get it on the black market, that desire, obviously that need will fuel this black market as long as the black market's profitable. So we're not going to stop it, but we're going to slow it down and hold back the tide a little bit as best we can.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I see some of the numbers, they're not very impressive, but maybe I'm not seeing all the numbers. I saw some number about 400 game wardens. Is that how many there are in the state of California?
Yeah, we're over that now, and we've gained a lot of game wardens because of funding through cannabis enforcement programs. We have close to 70 to 80 game wardens out of our 400 to 500 game wardens in California dedicated to just cannabis enforcement.
Okay, so
we certainly have the tactical unit I developed and those guys, but all these other marijuana permitting teams and watershed enforcement teams regulating on the private lands, the new quasi-legal growers, making sure they're compliant to make a bigger dent. So we're growing, but we're not growing fast enough to keep up with the demand and the problem out there by any means.
Yeah, so you're really just saying 70 are dedicated to the marijuana, what you call the MET, the Marijuana Enforcement Team.
Yeah, well, the Marijuana Enforcement Team is our tactical unit, the one we formed up that I talk about in Hidden War, and there's a handful of guys on that, only about 10 to 12, and canines. And then the rest of that, we're part of that 70, and the rest of those officers are on enforcement teams that don't deal necessarily with the outdoor trespass cartel threat. They deal with the private land, illegal or legal grows on people that are citizens here on their own private land, whether they've legalized or not.
And then Newsom, our governor, announced, I think it's been about a year ago now, that he was bringing National Guard troops to bear on the problem. But again, the number was pretty modest. I think it was like 140 National Guard members that were being redeployed from the border to these areas.
Right, right. And that was something really good our new governor did in California was acknowledge the trespass grow problem, even though regulation was supposed to solve that. He learned from reports and from experiences of what we were doing on the ground that after 2 years since Prop 64 was passed, the black market was thriving, the cartel groups weren't slowing down, and there was actually less pressure and attention from law enforcement on them in our national forests and our public lands once Prop 64 passed. And that catalyzed the need to bring in National Guard that we've worked with for the better part of 20 years very effectively. They've been involved in the counter drug task force when they're not deployed overseas of helping us in these cartel grow sites. But to make a concerted effort to move personnel to help us was a great move and definitely necessary.
And still seems like a pretty modest number, though, 140. I mean, still seems like we need a lot more than that.
To get every grow site, more people would help, definitely. Logistically, with all the other wildlife enforcement tasks we have on Fish and Wildlife front, all the things the National Guard have to do, it really comes back to force multiplying and bringing teams together because we're just understaffed in every single particular entity, whether it's game wardens, whether it's drug task force, narcotics task force members, police officers, sheriff's deputies, BLM rangers, Forest Service LEOs. There's just not enough of us to tackle this thing safely because these operations take a lot of personnel that are really well trained and skilled. They take really good canines to do them effectively and to get out of there safe because of the dangers we face. So it ties up a lot of resources to do one grow site. And if we're looking at 4,000 to 6,000 a year in California, it's real obvious when you start doing the numbers and the comparisons and you do those ratios and fraction it out. There's no way we have enough people and enough time in the day to get all of them.
What impact does being a sanctuary state have on the problem, would you say? I mean, just obviously, if you arrest somebody in California, he's not going to get deported. He's going to go through the court system, and he's going to spend time in jail, and then he's going to get out of jail, and he's free to then go back to his cartel work. So that's one impact of sanctuary state. Could you comment on what you see the implications are of that on this fight?
Yeah, I absolutely can. And I talk about this in the last chapter of Hidden War of what are we really doing with sanctuary state doctrine? We need to remember when we're talking about cartel, black market cannabis growers, and all those other crimes we talked about at the beginning of the show, we're not talking about people from Mexico that are illegal immigrants coming across the border to try to make a better family opportunity for themselves, get into the workforce, and not do anything harmful to the public or to wildlife. Our particular group that we're tackling are deportable felons. They're usually on international watch lists because they have felony convictions or arrest warrants for murder, for assault with weapons, for narcotics trafficking, you name it. And sanctuary state, unfortunately, protects those individuals from one, being deported or handled by ICE agents or federal agents that handle that as their general duties. But it also hinders us from doing anything with them through our court system. And working with federal officers that need to get these guys out of circulation and so they don't do any more harm in America. There's a little bit of a contradiction there, quite a bit of a contradiction, actually. And so sanctuary state as it sits right now to blanket protecting everybody coming up from Mexico illegally, I think needs to be looked at, especially when it comes to deportable felons that we're facing and how dangerous these guys are.
If there have federal charges out there pending against them, is there even cooperation in that regard, where they're handed over to the FBI or to the feds?
Yeah, again, it depends on what city and what state you're in. In California, for law enforcement, we've sometimes been given gag orders, and I talk about this in the new book, where we're on a case, we capture deportable felons. We've actually gotten gunfights with them, and or our canines have had to engage and bite a suspect that was armed and trying to bear a gun down on us. And because of sanctuary state, we were told, don't talk to ICE officers, don't talk to immigration services, because this needs to be let go. We're in a sanctuary state. That comes straight from the top. And that just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense because I don't think anybody that under the doctrine of, or the orchestrators, the builders of the sanctuary state doctrine in California, as an example, ever foresaw, or I would hope would not want to protect deportable felons from being handled in the justice system and at least taken out of circulation so they can't do any more harm to our wildlife, waterways, and wildlands. And worse than that, harm our public.
Yeah, well, Newsom could really, really score points politically if he were to come forward and say something along the lines you said is to recognize, because to his credit, he brought light to this problem. He's acknowledging that we've got Mexican drug cartels growing weed in our state, and we need to stop it. He should also come out and say, and also I'm going to modify the sanctuary state rules so that it only applies in certain circumstances and not others.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%. And kudos to our new governor for making that step, acknowledging it publicly, bringing National Guard members up, and differentiating the difference between deportable felons and immigration. Not making it about an immigration issue, not making it about a border control issue, but really making it about an environmental crime, destruction of our resources, and a public safety issue, and identifying who's causing that. And that would be neat to see. And, kudos if the governor does make that distinction and continues to put efforts to stopping these deportable felons decimating our wildlife.
And then what about just cooperation with the feds generally? Let's just say the DEA. Is the DEA doing all they should to work with you guys on this problem? Or is there a tension between federal and state as a result of sanctuary state, et cetera, and the fact that California has legalized marijuana, and the feds have kind of taken somewhat of a hands-off approach?
Absolutely. You're always going to have that tension because of the politics involved. But here's what I've learned. When it comes to boots on the ground and having run a team from the ground level, leading missions with my guys and doing our missions, and then working with ICE agents or FBI or DEA, we're all about protecting America. Nobody's anti-immigration. We're about protecting our wildlife and protecting our public safety. And we work together fine at the field level. When politics get involved up higher and, politically our directors and our chiefs are given certain directives that we can't work with the feds, tensions arise at the upper level echelon and hinder operations. They truly do. And they have in the past. They started to the second we had a sanctuary state doctrine in California, and really even after Prop 64 was passed. But the bottom line is, when it comes to the agents working the field, we're all on the same page. And we just want to protect our public, and we want to protect our wildlife resources from being decimated. And we'd like to see that transcend into the political arena to be more effective if we can.
Yeah, what I'm really saying is it would not surprise me if the feds, through the DEA and FBI, et cetera, are putting limited resources toward this problem in California, because they're saying, well, you guys are the ones that legalized it, so you legalize marijuana in your state, which it's still against federal law, and you guys are a sanctuary state, you're not cooperating with us on other things, so this is your problem, and the DEA is not putting as much resources into California as they might have otherwise.
That's absolutely the case, and something we've seen, and we're not getting a whole lot of federal help unless it's from those resource type agencies like BLM and Forest Service involved in cartel marijuana operations. We're not seeing it from the DEA anymore per se. We're not seeing it from the FBI. When it can involve them, unless it goes on a major interstate case, it's going to go back east and involve some illegal transport across state lines, things like that. But no, we're not seeing that type of cooperation, and understandably so. You hit that one on the head.
And going back to the legal market, we need to reduce the price on the legal market so that it's more competitive with the illegal market to help drive that out, right? What are you seeing that the state is doing wrong with the legal sale of marijuana?
Well, there's just red tape, and there's red tape since we regulated and Prop 64 was voted into effect a couple of years ago now. But we did not have the bandwidth, not only on my old agency's side, but in any other regulatory agency, licensing groups, to really get these new growers into the system quickly, efficiently, and get them operational and inspected and on track legally in an effective way. And when we look at all the permits that are required for these growers trying to legitimize themselves, even if they've come out of previously being black market growers for, say, 20 years, and it's going to cost them between $40,000 and $80,000 in permits, and they're going to have to wait 6 months to a year in a particular county in California before they can grow legally, we're not helping that legalization we all voted in for, right, wrong, or indifferent. We're not helping that process out. We're basically driving those growers back into the black market. So we need to eliminate the red tape of regulation if we're going to stay regulating in California. We have to make sure these growers are compliant environmentally. They're not harming the public safety, which if done correctly, they won't. But we're just not seeing that. We're seeing that black market thrive like we've been talking about so far on your show, because it's not an efficient process, and it's very slow, unfortunately.
We interviewed, coincidentally, a guy just this week about marijuana in Colorado. And he's written a book about it there, and really had 80% positive things to say about how it has gone in Colorado and been implemented and what it's done in reducing the black market, et cetera. It seems like it was implemented well there and perhaps not so well in California.
Well, it's a mixed bag in Colorado, honestly. Colorado still has and had a problem right when they regulated of black market interstate transport to the adjoining states just east of Colorado. So there was still a thriving black market from Colorado produced cannabis, not necessarily in Colorado per se, but to the other states. And this gets into the federal regulation issue. Do we look at widespread federal regulation across the board, making it fairly inexpensive or approachable that for cannabis users that are going to use cannabis, that they get it at an even price, an organically pure product that is universal across the nation, where the cartel's black market is virtually eliminated or significantly impacted. We need to look at that consideration as well, because none of the states that have regulated, honestly, including Colorado, have been without their problems of still generating a good black market in the states around them that haven't regulated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really silly that the federal government hasn't done anything yet to address this and basically change the law. I guess you're hearing some of it now in the Democratic debates. I noticed that at the last one, a couple of them came forward and said they want to legalize marijuana very early in their administration.
Yeah, I think it's always a hot button topic. You know, this is one of those things. And even though we named the book, the new book, Hidden War, because so few people seem to really know the depth of the problem and the damages going on environmentally and the threat to public safety that we have in our public lands. This is an issue that's hotter than people think. And it involves, even if you're not a cannabis user or don't really have a stance on cannabis one way or the other, you're getting affected by it directly or indirectly, whether it's environmental crime, water poisoning, threat to you in the outdoors, or a thriving black market that doesn't only involve cannabis, but in the case of the cartels, like we've talked about, all these other crimes. So it does need to be addressed. It needs to be looked at federally as a priority. And there definitely need to be changes in how we regulate in certain states like California, maybe other states as well. From our experience on the ground, it just makes the most sense.
Yeah. Well, certainly the federal government can change the law and make it no longer illegal from a federal standpoint, and then it would be up to the states. Each state can make its own decision whether or not to make it legal or illegal, which it seems to me this is exactly the type of issue that should be left up to the states. Whether or not you want to make something like marijuana legal in your state should be state by state, just as it's happening now, but they need to change the federal law, it seems to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you're hitting it on the head there. And again, this is something that we got to look from a unifying standpoint, and something I've really pushed in phase 2 since retirement from operations is, look, man, let's just get unified on this issue. Don't make it a left, don't make it a right, don't make it a pro-cannabis, anti-cannabis issue. Let's get unified what's going to protect our public the best way, keep our citizens safe, and protect our environment in the process. And along those lines, make sure people aren't getting the weed they're going to consume, whether it's legitimate or black market, from being poisoned by black market weed that's really potent and really affordable, but deadly when ingested. I mean, that's one of those just baffling things to me that we're not putting more attention to, that needs to be remedied. And I agree, federal attention is going to help expose that and keep the issue on point.
Tell us, before we wrap up, a little bit of what you learned on the border as far as human trafficking, the drug trafficking, the state of the cartels in Mexico today, et cetera.
Yeah, the interesting thing about the border is there's not much border there that hinders these guys from getting across. I was just down there a couple weeks ago hosting a new show we're doing called The Thin Green Line about conservation, ethical hunting, and border issues as the cartel is affected and coming across the border for all the crimes we discussed. And we have so much stretch of unprotected border right now that doesn't have a boundary, doesn't have a fence, doesn't have a wall, and has very little border patrol presence because it's so spread out. Southwest Texas is an example, certain parts of Arizona. And when I was on that ranch, which was just mind-blowing to me, this beautiful 50,000 acre ranch with tons of wildlife on it, tons of environmental purity, there were embedded cartel trafficking routes, hideout caves on the ranch, trafficking routes that some cartel traffickers were being interdicted, some were getting away and getting through, from human trafficking, bringing up 100-pound bindles of tainted weed that they produce across the border and bring it across to basically adjunct to what they're producing here in California. Not hard for them to get across. And like I talk about in the new book, the information we got is between $4,000 and $7,000 for any cartel organization to get their tier 1 growers or human traffickers across the border without even a blip. So border control is certainly a hot topic issue. Whatever we can do to slow down, especially the cartel element coming into America, I am definitely a proponent of. And I think by the public, the American public, knowing how easy it is to get across right now for these guys, I think everybody would agree if they start to see the facts down there.
And cartels are getting more powerful in Mexico or less?
More powerful, without a doubt. Right now, the cartels in many parts of Mexico are running Mexico. To think that there's government influence, it just isn't the case. My good friend Ed Calderon goes in this all the time from his experience down in Mexico and what we're seeing just over the border. You look at cities like Juarez, one of that was recently named a couple of years ago the most dangerous city in America, where the cartels are freely having their wars and the police are just kind of stepping back because they don't want to get involved because it's getting so violent. Just a couple of weeks ago, while filming that show, we were just on our side of the border from Juarez, and I was able to talk 100 yards from the wall, looking over into Juarez and see all the crime going on and the police response and the military response. And it was truly mind-blowing that was so close to our border. And knowing how freely they are operating down there and running things is alarming.
Yeah, my Mexico City friend says that this new president has been pretty weak on enforcement, that he's kind of a kumbaya president that says, come on, can't we all just get along? And he's reduced police enforcement and really allowed the cartels to run wild.
No, it's 100%. We're seeing the same thing. And the intel I get and my experiences down there and the people I keep in contact with on the border, especially, whether it be Border Patrol, BLM, or other agents on the border from Arizona all the way through Texas and New Mexico, are saying the same thing. And then to see it firsthand when we were down there in some of the most pristine border country I've ever been in a couple weeks ago, it was really an eye-opener, and definitely needs to be addressed on that side of the border, which is kind of outside of our influence, but something I think we need to look at country to country in the long term.
Yeah. Also, anecdotally, what I've kind of learned is the strongest border patrol that we have right now is actually the cartels themselves, because in hearing the story from my handyman who had to come across the border, he was stopped multiple times, not by Border Patrol. He was stopped by the cartels. And they were either telling him, pay us a bunch of money and we'll let you through, or you ain't going this way, with a gun in his face, basically. You go that way. And a trip that he had planned out on Google Maps that would have taken him a day and a half on, to cross the border. It ended up taking him 4 days to cross the border because there was a number of ways that he was not permitted to go, not by Border Patrol, but by the cartels.
Of course. Yeah. It's not the first story I've heard. I'm glad your friend was okay, because a lot of guys that encounter that don't always make it out to tell the story. So I'm glad he's safe, but that is a testament to what's going on down there. I've seen it when I've been in Mexico, racing in Baja. We've been interdicted and checked by some of those guys in the past. It's just a crazy world. It's a whole different culture, and it's a whole different mindset that we're dealing with down there. And anyone traveling down there needs to be aware of that and be careful.
Well, it's been a depressing day, John. I spent the previous part of the day talking about coronavirus, and now I got to hear about. I'm not sure which problem is worse after talking to you, because this sounds pretty bad.
Well, brother, I look at it this way. It's not a happy story, but it's an important story. And, there are positives, because one thing I've learned in retirement is, as much as pushing a rifle and being with my team and fighting this head on, grow after grow after grow, and trying to take these guys out of circulation, how rewarding that is. There's a lot more power in getting the message out, because the people speak. The pen is truly mightier than the sword. And I think that's what it's going to take to get, more federal administration, more funding, and regulation discussion on what we discussed, to protect America and protect Americans from this threat, whether we're talking about south of the border infiltration or embedded. And I appreciate you, and what gives me a little bit of optimism in conversations like this, as sad as they may be, is we're getting a little bit of reach through the work you guys are doing, and all we can do is keep it up and try to do it, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. What about wildfires? Is there, based on your experience as a game warden, is there something California should be doing that it's not doing?
Well, one thing I noticed in Montana, where I'm now located, is we just had last summer, and I'll compare this to California, that'll make sense. The last couple of summers in Montana, because we had no, select timber cutting and undergrowth harvest for the sake of wildlife movement, all that forest was just left unmanaged for the better part of 20 years, the last couple of administrations. And there was so much undergrowth and so much dry timber, and so little breathing room that it was basically a powder keg waiting to go off. And then we had a series of lightning strikes that pretty much had all of northwestern Montana in like 11 massive forest fires that lasted an entire summer. Structures were destroyed. We had this with the Paradise, California fire recently. We had so many structures, so many towns impacted, where if a little bit of select timber harvest without destroying the forest was opened up, it would not only benefit habitat for wildlife, but it would also slow down that forest fire issue, that problem under a perfect storm. And California needs to look at that in certain areas as well.
So in other words, you're saying we've got lots of,
we can balance it a little bit. It's good.
We've got lots of protected areas, you're saying, and some of those protected areas, it's time to perhaps allow some of the lumber industry in.
A little bit. And you can do it in such a way that is ecologically conscious, but it's also fire prevention, and it's also good for wildlife. It's moderation. We don't want to clear cut anything anymore. We don't want to strip the forest of all the timber out there, i.e. like the rainforest destruction we see in other parts of the world. But it really does transcend into safer for the public and for wildlife from fire damage, fire prevention, and things along those lines.
Thank you again to John Norris for coming on the Hidden Truth Show. You can check out his book, Hidden War, on Amazon. That's Hidden War, John Norris, Nores, Hidden War on Amazon. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker, and we'll be back with a special episode, a second episode this week on Friday. So check your phones for a new Hidden Truth episode coming this Friday. Thank you for listening to the Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to the Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.